Designers can achieve big reductions in the embodied carbon in buildings. Amy Hattan, Thornton Tomasetti's Corporate Responsibility Officer, is talking with in-house experts about how they're reducing the effect of buildings on climate change. Here's how Embodied Carbon is a production of Thornton Tomasetti.
Hi, and welcome to episode 15 of Here's How Embodied Carbon. This series explores how engineers and designers can fight climate change by reducing the embodied carbon or the emissions associated with building materials in the structures they design. I'm Amy Hattan. At Thornton Tomasetti, a multidisciplinary engineering and consulting firm, we've been focused on embodied carbon for over a decade, and we're channeling all of our capabilities to tackle climate change. I'm talking with colleagues about how they're achieving reductions in greenhouse gas emissions on their projects. Today, we'll be turning our attention away from emissions to think about a related topic, ethical decarbonization. I'm talking with Bridget Kane and Lisa Bolle of our Sustainability and Resilience practice. Bridget and Lisa co-lead the Ethical Decarbonization Working Group within our embodied carbon community of practice, and they are contributing to industry efforts to get unethical labor practices out of the supply chain for building materials. Hi, Bridget.
Hi, Amy.
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, Amy. Thanks for having us on today.
I'm really looking forward to talking about this emerging topic and point of concern. Can you give us some background on what is meant by ethical decarbonization?
Sure. To put it simply, Amy, ethical decarbonization is the concept that reducing carbon emissions from human activities must be accomplished in a way that is also ethically and socially responsible. A low-carbon, sustainable, and healthy future should be available to everyone and should do no further harm.
And so we have to acknowledge that the climate crisis is also a social crisis, and that humans and our actions are directly linked to the environment. It means that designers can no longer solve for only one variable, like emission. We should also keep in mind the human implications of our decarbonization strategies.
So you're asking us to think bigger picture about the impact of design decisions. That's exciting, but also a bit overwhelming. Where do we start?
Sure, that's an important feeling to acknowledge. This is certainly going to require us to hold multiple constraints in mind at the same time, because if we're only solving for one of these variables, it could set our society up for future crises down the road. We're going to have to hold both concepts at equal level, and it's going to take small, incremental steps and a lot of collaboration to create the groundswell that we need. First, we need to acknowledge that business as usual in our industry is not just carbon intensive, but in some cases, it's also reliant on forced labor, child labor, or other serious human rights violation.
It's important to understand that the status quo doesn't reflect the true market costs of goods and building materials, because it undervalues or sometimes even writes off entirely the labor of many marginalized people.
When most people think about a building, the labor involved in harvesting and manufacturing materials just isn't on their mind. Can you describe what happens in the construction industry that we normally don't think about?
Workers up the supply chain for building materials and their predecessors may be subject to forced labor. They could have their identification documents withheld, or they could be held in place to be able to perform the work. Workers can be underpaid, or the work could be reliant on prison labor. We also know that risky and dangerous manufacturing situations persist to this day, and there may be inadequate construction site safety. All of these things can undermine the health and well-being of workers and even the social stability of entire groups of people. This also isn't just a problem in other countries. We know that we experience labor inequality in the U.S. as well.
Lisa, you've worked with large companies who are trying to do better on environmental, social, and governance metrics. What could we learn about this topic from other industries that may have been earlier to see the human impacts?
Amy, as you mentioned, even though this is a new area for our industry, it's not a new topic globally. The fashion industry has had multiple expose moments that have revealed poor working conditions for textile and garment workers in countries known to be at high risk. Several well-known brands have come under fire in the past for sourcing from suppliers in places with questionable labor practices.
So it's actually rather common to come across ethics violations in manufacturing.
When we circle back to think about our own industry, we need to understand just how common this is. The International Labor Organization's Global Modern Slavery Report has determined that the construction industry ranks as the second highest factor for risk of forced labor behind domestic service.
Really? Why is that?
It's because the construction and manufacturing industries are still quite manual compared to the other more advanced sectors.
Okay, that makes sense. So how do we identify where these ethical violations occur in the supply chain?
Well, it's difficult to map our complex global material supply chains, especially because a lot of building products use composite ingredients or lots of subcomponents that go into the finished material. There's also a complete lack of required reporting on human welfare in our supply chains. These factors together make it difficult to understand if and where there's a risk of forced labor.
Okay, but even with the difficulties, there must be opportunities to create change in our industry.
Yes, there is. Construction methods and processes haven't changed a whole lot in the last 150 years. Our industry is one that's arguably struggling a bit to modernize and incorporate new technologies. But we know that designers can be really innovative and are good problem solvers. So if we can increase understanding of the problem, that can allow for innovation across our entire industry to help solve.
Exactly. Some of the research that's needed has started already. It's looking at risk by material type. In doing our own research, we learned about the most common building materials at risk for forced labor, and then from that list, our engineers work the most with glass, steel, brick, timber, and stone. So AEC professionals have a responsibility to understand the full impact of the materials that we choose for our projects. Every line an architect or engineer draws sets into motion a string of actions that have unavoidable environmental, social, and ethical repercussions.
To help us understand this better, can you share an example of a material or system that is commonly used in green buildings to achieve decarbonization and how ethics get involved?
Sure. So let's look at solar. Who can question the benefit of solar panels on a project, right? They reduce the building's operational carbon by providing zero emissions energy. They put sustainability on display for leaders, and it's mandated by law in some places like New York City. But if you're planning to launch a solar project, you've probably come across some news stories about supply chain issues and forced labor. Solar panel components are made from solar-grade polysilicon, and about half the world's polysilicon comes out of the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Xinjiang, China. This region is home to more than 11 million Muslims who've been imprisoned in re-education camps by the Chinese government since 2017. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, Muslims in these camps are subjugated to intense surveillance, religious restrictions, forced labor, and forced sterilizations. The U.S. has considered China's actions to constitute a genocide, and the United Nations calls this a crime against humanity.
That is not the sunny picture I usually associate with solar panels. Other than the obvious ethical dilemma, how can these social issues affect business?
Solar modules that were made using the forced labor from this region can expose an organization to significant financial risks. Global governments are cracking down on imports from Xinjiang unless there's proof that the products weren't made with forced labor. So there's an increased chance that a supply shipment will be seized at the ports, causing project delays and extra costs.
And another tricky part of this is the issue of how deep the supply chains in these solar-grade polysilicons can be buried. You might think you're purchasing an above-board solar panel made by a local manufacturer, but in reality, the solar modules might come from another country, which in turn sources that polysilicon from Xinjiang. When the supply chain is so many steps, it can make it really difficult to identify and address these risks. It's not about eliminating the use of helpful products like solar panels, but more about understanding the ethical issues and identifying low-risk suppliers.
This is a complex problem that's not going to be solved one firm at a time. Do you know of anything that's happening industry-wide that offers promise?
Well, it's going to take time for the industry to fully understand the risks in materials and their production processes, and the solutions aren't going to be easy. But one initiative that can help is Design for Freedom at Grace Farms. They have released early guidelines that we can use when working with suppliers, and they have an annual event, the DFF Summit, that is entirely focused on eradicating forced labor within our industry. We've attended this summit for the last 2 years. It's an inspiring event that's growing fast, and it's already well attended by many industry-leading peers and clients.
There are also some very helpful materials maps that have been developed to pinpoint risk within supply chains for the most commonly used construction materials. SourceMap and Verite have several great tools for this research. Because we live in a world of global supply chains where we can be up to 4 tiers away from the original source of extraction or production, it can be hard to track where labor infractions could happen. Being able to visualize this data on a map makes it easier to understand points of risk and find out where we can push for transparency in the supply chain.
Bridget, you've mentioned earlier that you've done some research into ethical decarbonization in our industry. Can you share some more of your findings?
Of course. We had a chance to interview various individuals, trusted partners, architects, contractors, and manufacturers. From these conversations, we've identified some key challenges and compiled a set of recommendations and action items.
There were 3 takeaways from these conversations that really stood out to us. The first is that there is value to a vetted materials list and library so that we can avoid the options with known links to modern slavery and highlight more ethical supply options. The second is that we learned about the value of simplified supply chain. Fewer materials really means fewer opportunities for modern slavery and fewer suppliers to monitor. The third is that everyone has a role to play. We face significant hurdles like a lack of strong national policy, but the largest obstacle in eliminating modern slavery in the built environment is understanding the specific actions that each discipline in our industry can take.
That is really helpful. Despite the challenges, I'm energized about the possibilities for rooting out poor labor practices in supply chains so that we can decarbonize our projects in an ethical manner. It seems like it's all about having better information. So I hope this podcast has provided information listeners need to join in on this important work. Bridget and Lisa, thank you so much for enlightening us on this important topic.
Thanks so much, Amy.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity.
Folks, there's more. Follow Thornton Tomasetti for more episodes of Here's How Embodied Carbon.